Good morning. We're live today from NorthJersey.com, The Record, and the USA Today Network for a conversation with New Jersey Attorney General Gubir Grewal. Hi, I'm Mike Kelly. Today our program focuses on police reform. General Grewal is leading a multifaceted effort at police reform right here in New Jersey, and that effort is considered a template for the rest of the nation. General Grewal, welcome to the program again. It's good to have you here. Before we talk about, thank you so much. Before we talk about what's happening here in New Jersey, I wonder if I could ask your reaction to the trial in Minneapolis this week that ended with an across-the-board conviction of a police officer who killed George Floyd. And really, Floyd's death really set off a national conversation on police reform. What was your reaction to that when you heard the news?
Well, I breathed a sigh of relief. I've tried a lot of cases, and you never know how juries are going to come back. But it was the right verdict. It wasn't justice, as the Attorney General in Minnesota so eloquently put it, but a step towards accountability, which is a step towards justice. So I think certainly the right verdict for the facts that were presented in that case, a step towards accountability. It does not erase the trauma that so many of us have felt, in particular Mr. Floyd's family, his loved ones. It does not bring back a lost loved one, but it puts us on a path towards justice. And for me, it just really helps underscore the urgency of the work we're doing here in New Jersey on policing reform.
I think it's important to know you come from a background in police in law enforcement. You were a federal prosecutor. You were also a county prosecutor right here in Bergen County. What's been the reaction from law enforcement to the verdict, or do you have much of a sense of that yet?
The conversations I've had with law enforcement officers across the board is that this is the right verdict. And I think the other conversation that I've had frequently over the last number of days is how it's important in this conversation on policing reform to show how New Jersey is different. There are training gaps certainly in other parts of the country. There are recruiting issues in other parts of the country. There are accountability issues in other parts of the country. But in New Jersey, we are taking steps to address all those issues. And we've started that hard work well before the events of this past summer. We started, in my case, back in 2018 on the initiatives that I'm pursuing. And New Jersey has done a lot before I got here to really be at the forefront when it comes to 21st century policing.
Well, let's talk about that. I remember you and I had a conversation last June. It was only weeks after George Floyd's death. And you mentioned, this struck me as really, I think, interesting. You said everything is on the table. And you came out with a fairly progressive and forward-thinking list of plans that you wanted to see enacted in police reform right here in New Jersey. I wonder if we could go through some of those and how they're doing. Let's talk about, you talked about chokeholds and a formal licensing plan for police, a methodology for tracking use of force, and more guidance on internal police investigations. And that, I thought that was quite an agenda. Just this past month, I think, your office put up a special internet portal in which ordinary citizens could check on use of force incidents by police officers throughout New Jersey. So let's talk about that portal first. How does that go?
Yeah, the portal is up. We put up a beta version of the portal, which allows the public to see how their police departments are doing. It allows members of the public to search by their local police department. They can look at other police departments in the county. And they'll see the reports of use of force by officer, and they can compare it to other departments, and you could see how force is being used against Black and brown communities. You could see the type of force that's being used, and importantly, it's a level of accountability in the sense that members of the public can take that information and now have a conversation with their local elected officials, with their local police chief, to ask informed questions about why trends are going a certain way in their locality. So from that perspective, it's an added layer of transparency and accountability. We've also shared the raw data with academic researchers, with the media, so they too can be part of this effort to hold law enforcement accountable and to keep an eye on how these trends are going. But I think what's important to note is that portal is just one piece, Mike. We've taken, you highlighted a number of things, and, it is well over, 15 or 20 or even 30 different policies and procedures, not just since last summer, but since 2018, that focus on promoting professionalism, focus on promoting accountability, focus on promoting transparency, focus on improving training. But with respect to the portal, the portal is the backstop of all of that. It's the backstop of our new use of force policy, which I'm happy to get into and describe in more detail. It's the backstop for our training to make sure that we're giving our officers tools to de-escalate and hold and to intercede when other officers are crossing the line and using force improperly. So, we have to look at it in a broader sense, that portal is just one piece of the work we're doing here.
Well, let's break that down a little bit. What I think is so interesting here is the word accountability. Why has it been, historically speaking, so hard to have some sort of accountability when it comes to police work?
I think the accountability has been there. We have had systems in place to hold law enforcement accountable, but I think what you have seen is that in some cases those systems have broken down. You've seen in other parts of the country where law enforcement officers have not been held accountable in the wake of a horrific use of force incident. Sure. And so because of that, if we look just at the events of the last number of years, the movement for Black lives in this country, the killing of George Floyd, the ensuing protests, all highlighted a crisis in confidence in policing, a lack of trust in policing, that large segments of the population did not feel that they could trust their law enforcement officers, that force was being used in a uniform way, that law enforcement was holding law enforcement accountable. So that when I said everything was on the table, it was to rebuild that trust, to highlight how in New Jersey we're different, to put in systems to show that we're improving our internal affairs process, that when law enforcement officers do cross the line criminally, that we do hold them accountable, and that when they are using force or discipline for infractions, we're being transparent about that. So the public knows that there are accountability measures and that we realize that there's more that can be done. So, I think that perception is there, often fueled by what happens in other parts of the country. But again, it underscores how we have to keep engaging with the public and showing how we're different here in New Jersey and all the controls we're putting in place to ensure that there's true accountability.
One of the conversations that we had, you and I, focused on training. Talk to me a little bit about how training is going to change here for police officers across the board in New Jersey. Sure.
And let me set the table, though, because I do want to talk about the use of force policy itself, because sure, that is the first step before the training. And so when we came up with this use of force policy, Mike, it was the first update to our state's use of force policy in 20 years. And we announced it at the end of last year. And we did it with robust community engagement. What I mean by that is that we had listening sessions in the middle of COVID, virtually in 21 of our counties, to hear about citizens' experiences with law enforcement use of force, to learn what the perception was, to really understand where that distrust was coming from. We also had robust engagement with law enforcement partners. They were at the table. They were part of the revision process. And that's because if you want systemic change, you have to have that systemic buy-in. And so we had a big table, virtually, of course, and we sat down and we worked through the issues and we worked on principles that we all agreed on. We had the Chiefs Association, the PBA, we had NOBLE, the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, the NAACP, ACLU, citizens groups. And we said, what are those things that we can agree on, all of us? And the very first principle of our use of force policy is that we are going to do everything to uphold the sanctity of all life in every police interaction. And we're going to move from there. And we're going to move from there always trying to de-escalate. That we have an affirmative duty in this state to de-escalate, and that if force is going to be used, it always must be reasonable, proportional, and necessary force. And if deadly force is going to be used, it has to be a last resort. And importantly, all officers in the state under that new policy have a duty to intervene. They have a duty to intervene if they see a fellow officer crossing the line, using force improperly, or doing things that go against training. If force is used, deadly force is last, but there always has to be a command level review of what happened. And that's more than just looking at the reports. It's looking at the videotape. It's really digging into what happened. And then we have to oversee that, the prosecutors, the Attorney General's office, to make sure, that force is being used in the right way and as a last resort. So that's the policy. There's other parts to it. No chokeholds, positional asphyxiation, what we saw with the knee on the neck in Minneapolis. That we don't do that. And as long as someone is, once they're handcuffed, you put them in an upright position. All common sense things. You can't shoot at moving vehicles. You can't shoot from moving vehicles. Police pursuits, putting limits on them. So that's policy. But I understand that policy is just paper, and you got to change culture, and that's the training. And so there's two days of training, Mike, that we're going to do in this state for every officer. One day is what we call critical decision making. And that day involves looking at videotapes, looking at those what we call lawful but awful interactions we've seen in other parts of the country where force may have been justified. It may have resulted in a horrible outcome, the loss of life perhaps. But looking at videotape, we could always learn how to do better and how to resolve that situation and de-escalate that situation without using force. And the second day of that training is active bystandership. That's to ensure that in this state, we don't have 3 cops standing by while a fourth kills somebody. And so that is to teach those other officers skills to intervene. And that's the importance of this training. It is best in class. It is something no other state has done. And in New Jersey, when we do this is an important point. It's every police department, every police officer. This policy applies to everyone, and the training applies to everyone. No other state can do that.
When you expect the program to kick off?
So the use of force policy is implemented. We've drafted it. It takes full effect by the end of this year. If you go to our website, njoag.gov/policing, you could find it there. The training is going to be done by the end of this year. We may have some delays because of COVID, because there's in-person training and there's limitations on doing that. But the goal is to have everything done by the end of this year. And it's historic because when a police department in another part of the country decides to do something like this, it's a one-off. It's one police department in one state that may adopt these types of policies. But here in New Jersey, it's every department, every officer going through this standardized training. It's not, for example, in Delaware, I talked to the AG there. She has 26 police departments and probably 13 different use of force policies and 13 different standards on how departments can interact. And so that's what's unique about New Jersey that I think needs to be highlighted. We are different, and we are a model, I think, for the rest of the country on these issues.
It's quite amazing when you consider the history of police interactions with, particularly with African Americans in our state. I mean, I don't have to remind you about the difficulty that the state police or the criticism the state police came under in the 1990s for stops on the New Jersey Turnpike. Why is this? First question, though, what I was impressed by with the listening sessions were the fact that you actually got the police unions to sit down with you. How did you manage to do that?
I think when you have a good process, when you're building out policy, when you're listening to all stakeholders, I think people naturally buy into what you're working on. They feel included, and I think our police unions have to be a part of the solution. And to the credit of the police unions, to our police leadership in this state, they all want to get this right. They all want to make sure that we are not on the national news for training gaps and for horrific police-citizen interactions. Sure. They all want to, and I want to, lift up all the positive interactions. So I think we have issues that we need to address in New Jersey, but we also need to recognize we have tremendous police leadership. We have tremendous union leadership who are focused on making sure New Jersey is moving in the right direction. Do we agree on everything? No. There are things where we are butting heads on. But I think on these policy and training issues, they want more tools. And because of our structure in New Jersey, we can work together and give them those additional tools, that training. It's incumbent on us to give them that training, and the police leadership need to have a hand in how that training is developed and how those policies are developed. And I couldn't be more proud of the fact that when we announced that policy at the end of December in a virtual press conference, I was standing on screen or sitting on screen. The next screen was the the union leadership, the Chiefs Association, the state police, ACLU, the other civil rights organizations, all coming together and lifting up a policy that I think really sets New Jersey apart from the rest of the country.
Let's talk about this notion of critical thinking. I think this is vitally important. I mean, just some background here. Years ago, I did quite a bit of research on police deadly force for a book I was writing, and I actually took the deadly force test at the Bergen County Police Academy. I flunked that test, by the way. And what struck me about so much of police training decades ago was the fact that it was focused on basically learning to subdue people, learning to use your gun properly, and that sort of thing. I didn't really hear a lot about the critical thinking aspect, although I do know from talking with veteran police officers that this is something that they think about a lot. Now that's going to get blended formally into training. How is that different, and why is that different?
It's different because we're actually using the videotapes, right? We have body cams now. We'll have body cams across. New Jersey deployed fully by June, thanks to legislation that the governor signed into law recently. But we've never in the past sat down and broken down that videotape and seen how we could do better. So this critical decision-making block that we'll go through is really an effort to take those interactions, not the ones that you don't have to look at every horrible one, but you look at a lot of them and you say. You break it down and you say, what could have been done differently? How could you have bought time here? How could we have better responded to this particular interaction and gotten to a better outcome? And I think every other profession that has access to videotape or has the ability to do an after action does that. But now we're incorporating it into a training, and we're going to do it statewide, as I mentioned a moment ago, and we're going to figure out how we could do better. And because we know we could have better outcomes. We've seen situations in Camden. Camden implemented a lot of this before the rest of the state.
Sure, Camden is a national model.
They are a national model, and they implemented this de-escalation training, the critical decision-making training, and that's why when you see videotapes from Camden, you see officers responding to a person with a knife in one case that I recall. And what they do is they use time as a tactic. And that's part of critical decision making. So you get to a situation, if an individual doesn't pose a threat to anyone else but themselves, they have a knife, you don't have to resolve the situation right away. We're not in a rush to resolve that situation. And that is something that needs to be emphasized. There are going to be those cases where you don't have time to think. But right. If you respond to a situation, you see this gentleman with a knife, well, let's take a step back. Let's secure the area. And that's what they did in Camden a couple of years ago. And this videotape went viral. They walked with this gentleman for city block after city block after city block with the perimeter. He dropped the knife and the situation resolved. But I've seen the opposite too, where we go in too quickly to resolve a situation where there's no threat to anybody else. And it results in a use of force. It results, worst case yet, in a shooting. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to, teach time as a tactic. We're trying to use videotapes to see how we could respond better, give officers the tools to de-escalate, to talk down a situation, and try to get other mental health professionals in there to resolve the situation, because now we have time to get them there.
I think it needs to be acknowledged here that this is not easy. It's one thing to train doctors, for example, in new techniques, or nurses, or even journalists in new techniques. But it's something else to train police officers, because so much of their work is potentially very dangerous, and they have to be aware of that. How do you overcome that factor with cops?
Well, I mean, all of this training is developed by law enforcement, so we have credibility because of that, and it's training that takes into consideration all of those realities that you face as a law enforcement officer. That it's an inherently dangerous profession, and we recognize that. And we're not saying that you have to go through a mental checklist every time, but we're trying to give you tactics when you are able to respond to a situation in a certain way, to buy time and to try to resolve it without using force. I don't think, law enforcement officers go out there, with the intent to use force. We just need to give them the tools to make sure that when they do use force, it's as a last resort. And I think, certainly the training is part of that. Certainly to have credible partners in this training. The people who developed this training initially are from the Police Executive Research Forum. It's a group of police executives from around the country that came up with it. It's been implemented in other jurisdictions where force has come down and citizen interactions have improved and internal affair complaints have decreased. So having that body of data helps get the buy-in for it as well.
I wonder if we could look ahead a moment here about the kinds of tools that police have. There's been a lot of talk now about trying to come up with nonviolent ways or less violent ways of subduing people and that sort of thing. Has your office been looking at any other tools that cops can have? Because, frankly, the police tool belt hasn't really changed all that much in many, many, many years. What can we look at perhaps in the future that cops might have?
So, we've stood up a committee to look at less lethal alternatives to use of force, other than a firearm. Certainly tasers are an option. There are other products that project it's called a bolo wrap, where it projects a netting.
Right.
And, we're studying these with beanbags and things like that. But I can't emphasize enough that time is a tool. And the training to give officers the ability to buy time and to just pause when safe to do so and assess the situation and employ that critical decision making, that's an important tool that we're giving them, as well as the de-escalation techniques. We haven't gotten into the crisis intervention team training aspect of what we're doing in this state. We haven't gotten into how we're having team training with cops and mental health professionals working together to figure out and teach cops that these are the signs of someone who might be in a mental health crisis, and here are some tactics to deal with that. So, we're giving them all of those additional tools. But, I think, one important thing that we haven't talked about today, Mike, is that, so much of our conversation is about, after somebody's on the job. It's about how we're going to discipline them and how we're going to hold them accountable and how we're going to retrain them. We also have to look at front-end accountability, and that's a conversation, for another half hour. But front-end accountability is who's coming into law enforcement? Who are we recruiting into law enforcement? Are we recruiting those candidates who are going to be those critical decision makers, who are going to truly be guardians of their community and not warriors? And part of that is who we're bringing in. Part of that is the training on the front end. If you're yelling at people for 22 weeks or 24 weeks, as the case may be, how do you expect them then to just walk onto the street and have positive interactions when, they've been in this environment? I understand, to sensitize them to extreme situations, but we need to reimagine that as well. And we are.
Well, I guess you're talking about the police academy. Yeah, it's almost like a boot camp environment. Sure.
It is. You can't train them like warriors and soldiers for 20 plus weeks and then expect them to hit the streets to be community-oriented cops.
Right.
There's a disconnect there, and we're trying to fix that with our police training commission to really scrap our police training manual, which has just existed for years, and we just add on the latest training to the back of it and the latest training to the back of it, and just wipe it clean and just say, how do we produce the best law enforcement officers who are going to be guardians in their community, who are going to be on the ground in their community, talking to young people, taking the time to guide young people and resolve situations in a peaceful manner and have positive interactions. And that's part of our efforts here in New Jersey. So I don't want it to get lost in our conversation that it's all about accountability on the back end. It's all about retraining on the back end. It's all about more tools to resolve situations short of using force on the back end. A lot of our efforts are also on the front end. It's about who we're bringing into the profession, how we're training them, and how we're integrating them. I'm in Newark today. Roz Baraka and former Director Ambrose, they make all their new recruits walk the streets as community police officers first, so they can engage with community members and get to know community members, and so community members can get to know them. And man, that leads to positive outcomes. It creates trust, and it leads to better public safety. Well,
I want to thank you for this conversation. This is very interesting, and of course, there are all kinds of interesting leads that you've given us, and we want to return to this conversation at some point. But I want to thank you, General Grewal, for coming on with us today. And for the record, for NorthJersey.com and the USA Today Network, I'm Mike Kelly.